The land between the human settlement and the predator clans had always been filled with tension. It was a silent border, one where eyes watched from the shadows, and footsteps were measured carefully. For years, the predators had spoken in whispers about the woman who lived close to that edge. She was different from the others. She did not live among her own kind in the safety of their village walls, but chose instead to stay in a small cabin on the outer edge, close enough to hear the growls at night, and close enough to see the faint glimmer of predator eyes in the dark. To the elders of the predators, her presence was unsettling. Humans were clever, they thought, always building, always planning, always scheming. And this one, the woman alone in the cabin, was too close, too fearless. Why did she not hide? Behind her people's protection? Why did she not fear the wild as others did? The questions turned into suspicion, and suspicion soon turned into a decision. The elders gathered under the old stone pillars where they made their choices. They decided not to approach her directly, for they wanted to know her secrets without revealing their own. Instead, they turned to the young ones, the cubs who had not yet taken their place as warriors, but had begun their training. The cubs were sharp, full of energy, and eager to prove themselves. Sending them would serve two purposes. They could learn discipline by completing the task, and the elders could learn what the human woman was truly doing near their borders. To the cubs, the mission sounded simple enough. Watch her, learn her ways, return with the truth. The cubs were excited, their hearts pounding with pride as they were chosen. They imagined stories of catching the human doing something dangerous, something clever that would prove the elders right. They pictured returning with proof that would earn them honor, maybe even faster recognition in their clan. None of them imagined that this assignment would change them forever. The next morning, the cubs crept toward the edge of the border where the woman lived. They had been told to remain unseen, to hide in the tall grass and shadows of the trees. Their eyes glowed faintly as they peered through the distance. What they expected was mystery. What they found was something far more ordinary, yet strangely confusing. The woman was outside her cabin carrying buckets of water from a nearby stream. Her movements were slow but steady, her steps careful on the uneven path. She did not look like a warrior or a schemer. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back loosely, and there was nothing threatening in her hands, only the weight of her daily tasks. She set the buckets down and paused, breathing heavily, then smiled faintly to herself before walking back again. The cubs watched with narrowed eyes. Was this a trick? Were humans known to hide their true nature behind simple acts? As the day stretched on, the cubs watched her work. She chopped wood, though not very skillfully. She gathered food and arranged it neatly. She sat outside in the sunlight, mending torn cloth with slow, clumsy stitches. Everything she did seemed quiet, almost fragile. Yet there was something steady in her presence, something that made the cubs tilt their heads in confusion. If she was weak, why did she not leave? Why did she live here, where the wild pressed close against her door? The cubs whispered among themselves, their young voices carrying questions they had no answers to. One suggested that she must be pretending, another said she might be baiting them, and yet another insisted that perhaps she was stronger than she appeared. None of them could agree. But one thing was certain. They could not return yet. They had to watch more. When evening came, the woman lit a small fire outside her cabin. She placed food into pots, the smell drifting across the air and reaching the hidden cubs. Their noses twitched, their stomachs growling, though they did not move. They had been told to remain hidden, to never reveal themselves. Yet, to their surprise, the woman suddenly looked up, directly toward the shadows where they hid. For a moment, the cubs froze. Did she know? Could she see them? Her eyes lingered, then softened, and she placed a few pieces of food on a flat stone not far from her fire. Without saying a word, she turned back to her own meal. The cubs looked at one another, confused. Was it a trap? Was she trying to lure them closer? Hunger made the choice for them. Slowly, carefully, they approached the stone when she was not looking. The food was warm, fresh, and smelled better than anything they had imagined. They ate quickly, their small claws clutching at the meal, their eyes darting nervously back at her. But she did not move. She did not even glance their way. Again. The next day, the cubs returned to watch again. And again, they found food placed on the stone, waiting for them. The woman carried on with her work as though she were unaware of their presence. But the cubs began to sense that she knew. She knew, and yet she welcomed them. Not as spies, not as enemies, but as guests. Each day, the cubs watched her with growing curiosity. They saw the way she bent down to help a small injured bird, holding it gently in her hands before letting it fly again once it healed. They saw the way she whispered to herself when she was lonely, her voice soft like the wind. They saw the way she worked tirelessly even when her body looked tired. None of these things fit the stories the elders had told them about humans. Humans were supposed to be selfish, clever, always plotting, but this woman seemed different. The cubs began to feel something they did not expect. At first, it was only curiosity. Then came a strange kind of warmth, one they could not name. She reminded them of someone older, someone who gave care without asking for anything in return. It was unsettling, yet comforting. She was supposed to be a target. Yet somehow, she felt like a protector. When the time came for the cubs to return with their first report, they hesitated. What could they say? That the woman lived quietly, worked hard, and offered food to shadows she could not. See, the elders would not believe such a thing. They would demand proof of her danger. They would expect the cubs to reveal her secrets. But the cubs had no secrets to tell. All they had was the truth, that she had welcomed them unknowingly with kindness. So they told the elders very little, only that they needed more time, that the human woman was cautious and hard to understand. The elders allowed them to continue, unaware of the bond that was slowly forming. Back at her cabin, the woman continued her life, never speaking to the cubs directly, but always leaving food, always moving as though she understood they were near. And in their young hearts, the cubs began to feel a shift they could not yet explain. What started as an assignment was slowly turning into something more, something that would change them in ways no training could. They had been sent as spies, but deep inside, they were already beginning to feel like her guests. Day after day, the cubs returned to the woman's small cabin at the edge of the border, their sharp eyes peering through the trees, their ears alert to every sound. At first, it was only duty that drew them there. They had been sent to spy, to search for secrets, to find danger in her life. But the more they watched, the less she seemed like an enemy. The woman lived simply, her days filled with small tasks that looked ordinary, yet carried a quiet strength. She gathered wood with effort, her arms trembling at times, but she never stopped until the pile was enough to last through the cold nights. She carried water from the stream, her steps slow but steady, never spilling more than a drop. She spoke softly to herself while she worked, her words carried away by the breeze, though the cubs could sometimes catch fragments, small notes of gratitude for the day, small hopes for tomorrow. The cubs were confused. They had been told humans were greedy, always taking more than they needed, always demanding, always destroying. But here was a human who took only enough for herself, who worked with her own hands, who gave back in small ways. They saw her plant seeds in the soil and water them gently, waiting patiently for green sprouts to push through. They saw her scatter crumbs of food for birds, smiling faintly when they landed nearby without fear. She even left bits of cloth and straw near the edge of the woods, which small animals used to build their nests. None of it made sense to the cubs. Why would someone waste time on such things? Why would a human care about creatures too small to be of use? One afternoon, the cubs saw something that stayed with them. The woman had been carrying a basket of gathered roots and berries when she heard a faint sound near the path. She set the basket down and followed the noise, and the cubs, curious, crept closer. In a tangle of bushes, a young rabbit lay caught in a snare, its leg twisted painfully. The cubs bristled at the sight, for to them, such prey was meant to be taken, without hesitation. But the woman did not claim it for herself. Instead, she knelt, her hands gentle as she loosened the snare and freed the frightened animal. She cleaned its wound with water from her flask and spoke softly, almost like a mother soothing a child. When the rabbit finally limped away, she only smiled, picked up her basket, and returned to her cabin. The cubs whispered among themselves that night. Why would she do such a thing? She had food in her hands, yet she let food slip away. They tried to understand, but no answer satisfied them. Slowly, however, they began to feel something stir inside them, curiosity mixed with a strange respect. As the days passed, the woman seemed to sense their presence more and more. She continued leaving food on the flat stone, never forcing them to approach her directly, never demanding they show themselves. Sometimes she placed not only food, but also small, shiny objects, smooth stones, pieces of cloth, or bits of string. The cubs did not know what to do with these gifts, but they carried them back anyway, keeping them hidden as though they were treasures. It was a game they did not understand, yet it made them feel seen, as if she were acknowledging them without words. They began to notice other things too. The woman laughed sometimes, quietly, when something amused her. A bird hopping clumsily on the ground, or a squirrel trying and failing to steal her food. Her laughter was soft, yet it carried through. The trees and the cubs found themselves listening for it. They did not know laughter like hers. Among their kind, laughter was rare, usually sharp and short, often carrying a sense of mockery or victory. But hers was different. Gentle, unguarded, almost as though it invited them to share in her joy. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and fire, the cubs found themselves creeping closer than ever before. They settled near the edge of her firelight, still hidden, but no longer so distant. She sat by the flames, sewing a tear in her cloak, humming a soft tune as she worked. The cubs lay down in the grass, watching in silence, and for the first time, they did not feel like spies. They felt like children watching something safe, something that warmed them. It was then that they began to question the words of their elders. The elders had said humans were selfish, but this human gave food to creatures weaker than herself and shared even with unseen guests. The elders had said humans were cunning, but this human showed her every action openly, with no tricks, no hidden motives. The elders had said humans were dangerous, yet this human sat alone at night, her only weapons tools for survival, not for war. The questions grew louder inside them. If their elders were wrong about her, could they also be wrong about other humans? The cubs had no answer, but doubt had already taken root. The change within them was quiet, almost invisible at first. They stopped seeing her as part of their mission and began seeing her as part of their world. They no longer crept toward her out of duty, but out of desire, as if they needed to be near her presence. They began imitating her in small ways. When she worked patiently, they too practiced patience with one another instead of snapping in frustration. When she shared food, they found themselves sharing instead of fighting for the larger piece. When she laughed, they tried to mimic the sound, though awkwardly, their voices rough but eager. One night, a storm rolled over the borderlands, fierce and wild. Rain poured from the sky, winds tore through the trees, and thunder shook the ground. The cubs, frightened and shivering, huddled near the edge of the woman's cabin. She stepped outside with a lantern, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, and for a moment, her eyes locked on theirs. The cubs froze, expecting anger or fear. Instead, she set a small basket beneath the shelter of her porch, filled with food and a folded blanket. Without a word, she returned inside, leaving the door closed but the fire within glowing bright. That night, the cubs curled together under the blanket, the storm raging above them, and for the first time, they felt cared for in a way that training and orders had never given them. It was not strength they felt, nor fear, but something softer, something that made them feel safe. By the time the storm cleared, their mission no longer felt like a mission. It felt like belonging. They had been sent to watch her, to report on her life, to find evidence of threat. But all they found was kindness. And in that kindness, they discovered something new inside themselves: admiration, respect, even love, though they were too young to name it. Each day after, they carried not only food from her stone, but also lessons in their hearts. They learned that patience could be stronger than claws, that sharing could build more trust than fear, and that laughter could heal more wounds than silence. Slowly, they began to see her not as a human stranger, but as something far greater. To them, she was no longer the woman by the border. She was becoming something like an alpha, not through dominance or force, but through the quiet strength of her way. The cubs did not know how long they could keep this secret from their elders. They did not know what would happen if the truth was discovered. But for now, they did not care. They returned to her again and again, no longer out of duty, but out of choice. Their hearts had already chosen a path their minds could not yet explain. The sky had been heavy all day, thick with clouds that rolled like dark waves across the horizon. The cubs had sensed the change, their ears twitching at the low rumble of thunder that echoed through the borderlands. The wind picked up as the evening fell, carrying with it the sharp bite of cold. The woman, who had spent the day gathering what little firewood she could, paused often to glance at the sky. She seemed to know the storm would not be a gentle one. The cubs lingered nearby, restless, their instincts telling them to hide, yet their hearts refusing to stray too far from her. By the time night arrived, the storm had broken open with a fury the cubs had never seen before. Rain poured in sheets, blinding and relentless. The trees bent under the weight of the wind, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The ground turned to mud, sucking at their paws as they scrambled for cover. Thunder roared overhead, shaking the very earth, while lightning split the sky into shards of white fire. The cubs, scattered in the chaos, called out to one another, their voices lost in the roar of the storm. Fear surged through them. They were young, untested, and though they had been taught to survive, no lesson had prepared them for this. One cub, smaller than the rest, slipped into a swollen stream that had burst its banks. The rushing water pulled at its small body, dragging it downstream. Another cub clung to a tree root, its claws digging into the mud as the wind tore at its fur. A third ran blindly into the night, its eyes wide with panic, unable to find the others. For the first time since their mission began, they were not spies, not watchers. They were frightened children, alone in a storm too powerful to fight. And then, through the chaos, came the figure of the woman. She had no cloak to shield her, only her thin garments already soaked through with rain. Her hair clung to her face, her hands trembling from the cold, but she moved with a steady determination. A lantern swung in her hand, its light dim and flickering, yet enough to cut through the darkness. Her voice rose above the storm, not loud, not commanding, but firm and clear, carrying a calmness that cut through their panic. She called out, not with anger or fear, but with the same steady warmth she always carried, as if she believed they could hear her no matter how fierce the storm. The cub caught in the stream cried out, its body slipping beneath the water again and again. Without hesitation, the woman dropped her lantern on the muddy bank and waded in. The water clawed at her, pulling at her legs, but she pushed forward, her arms stretching through the dark waves until her fingers found the small body. With a strength born not from muscle but from refusal to let go, she hauled the cub against her chest and stumbled back to the shore. The cub coughed and shook, its fur plastered to its skin, but it was alive. She wrapped her own body around it, shielding it from the wind as she searched for the others. She found the one clinging to the tree root next. Its claws had torn against the bark, blood mixing with rain, but it refused to release its hold. She knelt beside it, prying its tiny paws free, whispering words of comfort, though it could not understand her language. She cradled it close, placing it beside the other cub under the meager shelter of her arm. They trembled together, their wide eyes fixed on her face, finding safety not in the storm's silence but in her presence. The last cub proved the hardest. It had run farther, deeper into the storm, its cries faint and scattered. The woman stumbled. Through the mud, her lantern long lost, guided only by the desperate sound of a frightened voice. Her body shook with exhaustion, her hands scraped and bleeding from the branches she pushed aside. Yet she did not stop. Every step forward was heavy, every breath stolen by the icy wind. But she pressed on. At last, she found the cub crouched beneath a fallen branch, its body shivering, its ears pinned flat against its head. She knelt beside it, reaching out slowly, gently, as though calming a terrified child. When it flinched back, she did not force it. She simply held out her hand, steady in the storm, waiting until the cub edged closer on its own. When it finally allowed her touch, she lifted it into her arms and turned back toward the others. By the time she gathered them all, her body was near collapse. Her clothes clung to her like ice, her breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs threatened to give way with every step. Yet she walked on, carrying 2 of the cubs and guiding the 3rd pressed close against her side. They huddled together beneath her cloak, their small forms trembling, their wide eyes watching her with something they had never felt before. She was not just saving them. She was protecting them in a way only an alpha would. Back at the cabin, she lit a fire with shaking hands, her fingers barely strong enough to strike the flint. The flames sputtered to life, filling the small room with warmth and light. She laid the cubs on blankets, drying their fur with pieces of cloth, her touch gentle despite her own exhaustion. When one whimpered, she pressed her hand against its side, holding it until it calmed. When another shivered too violently, she pulled it against her chest, wrapping her arms around it as though her own body could give it strength. The cubs, for the first time in their young lives, felt what it meant to be truly protected, not because of fear, not because of rules, not because of strength shown through dominance, but because someone chose to stand between them and the storm. They had elders who commanded them, who demanded obedience through power. But this human, this fragile creature who should have been weaker than all of them, had shown them another kind of strength. She had faced the fury of nature itself, not with claws or teeth, but with determination born of care. As the storm raged outside, the cubs pressed closer to her, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet unwilling to leave her side. They could hear the thunder still, but it no longer frightened them. They could feel the wind still, but it no longer chilled them. All that mattered was the warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the quiet way she hummed to soothe them, as if they were her own. That night something shifted forever in the hearts of the cubs. They had been sent to spy, to watch, to judge, but in the storm, all that had been stripped away. What remained was a truth they could not deny. She had become their protector, their shield, their alpha, not by claiming the role, not by demanding it, but by living it in the moment they needed it most. When the storm finally passed and dawn crept over the horizon, the cubs woke to the soft glow of sunlight on the cabin walls. The woman slept lightly beside the fire, her body curled around them as though even in dreams she refused to leave them unguarded. The cubs lay still, watching her, their young minds struggling to understand the weight of what had happened. They no longer saw her as a human stranger. They no longer saw her as the subject of their mission. To them, she had become family, and, deep inside, though they could not yet put it into words, they made a silent vow. They would never let harm come to her. Just as she had protected them in the storm, they would one day protect her. The storm passed slowly, leaving behind a broken landscape. Trees stood stripped of their branches, the earth soaked and scarred, streams swollen beyond their banks. The cubs woke to the sound of quiet rain dripping from the cabin's roof, their small bodies still pressed close to the warmth of the fire, and the woman who had sheltered them all night. She was still there, sitting near them with her head resting against the wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her hands resting protectively near their sides. Even in sleep, her presence was steady, as though her spirit itself refused to abandon them. For a long moment, the cubs lay in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and feeling the weight of what had just happened. They remembered the storm, the terror, the helplessness, the way the raging winds had thrown them apart. And they remembered her, walking through the darkness with no fear for her own safety, carrying them back one by one. She had not hesitated. She had not treated them as spies or enemies. She had treated them as if they mattered more than her own life. When she stirred awake, the cubs rose to their feet, their small eyes fixed on her. She smiled faintly, though her face was pale from fatigue, and set about making food from what little she had. She divided it carefully, ensuring each cub had a fair share, even leaving the smallest portion for herself. The cubs hesitated at first, as though unsure how to accept this gift. But hunger and trust overcame their hesitation, and they ate. It was not just the food that filled them. It was the realization that she shared even when she had so little. By midday, the storm had cleared. The sky, once dark and violent, now stretched wide and blue above the land. The elders would be waiting. The cubs knew their mission was unfinished. They had been sent to watch her, to uncover her secrets, and to return with a report. Their paws shifted uneasily against the earth. They were supposed to carry home answers, warnings, perhaps even accusations. But as they looked at her hands still bruised from clawing through mud, her body weary yet uncomplaining, they knew the truth had changed. The path home was long, winding through the soaked forests and muddy clearings. The cubs walked together, their steps slower than usual, their thoughts heavy. But when the woman shouldered her pack and began walking, they moved to her side instinctively, not behind her as followers, not in front as scouts, but beside her as companions. Birds called from the branches above, testing the silence after the storm, while the ground squelched beneath their feet. Every step they took carried the weight of a choice they had not yet spoken aloud. When the settlement finally came into view, the air grew tense. The elders stood waiting, tall and stern, their eyes sharp with suspicion. They had expected the cubs to return quickly with reports, not days later walking side by side with the very human they had been sent to watch. Murmurs spread through the gathered crowd as eyes fell upon the strange sight. Predator cubs, proud and untamed, walking not in defiance, but in loyalty to someone outside their kind. The eldest among them stepped forward, his voice deep and demanding. He asked why they had taken so long, why they had returned in this strange formation, why the human dared to stand among them. His questions carried authority, and his gaze bore down on the cubs with the weight of expectation. This was the moment of truth, the moment when they were supposed to deliver their findings as spies. The cubs stood silent at first, exchanging glances. They were young, but the storm had carved something new into their hearts. One by one, they stepped closer to the woman, pressing themselves against her side, their eyes never leaving the elders. The smallest cub, the one she had pulled from, the river, spoke first. Its voice trembled, but its words were clear. They told of the storm, of how she had come for them when they were lost, of how she had carried them, shielded them, and given them safety even when her own life was at risk. Another cub added its voice, speaking of how she had treated them, not as spies or burdens, but as family. They spoke of her kindness, of her patience, of the way she had shared food and warmth. They told the elders that the human had shown them something they had never known before: care given without demand, loyalty earned without fear. The crowd grew restless. The elders exchanged doubtful looks, their pride unsettled by the words of the young. They had sent the cubs to return with warnings of danger, not with tales of devotion. But the cubs did not falter. Together, they moved closer to the woman, their stance unshakable. They refused to step away from her, refused to betray what they had discovered. The eldest elder's voice grew sharper, commanding them to remember their duty. "You were sent as spies," he said. "You were sent to protect your people by uncovering her secrets. Why do you return standing at her side instead of standing against her?" The cubs lifted their heads, their young voices rising together. They answered not with defiance, but with truth. She had become their protector, their alpha, not by force, not by command, but by choice. She had risked everything for them, and in doing so, she had earned something stronger than obedience. She had earned loyalty. The silence that followed was heavy. The elders had no words for a moment, their authority shaken by the sincerity of the cubs' voices. The crowd whispered among themselves, torn between suspicion and awe. And through it all, the human stood quietly, saying nothing, her hands folded before her. She did not defend herself, did not argue, did not ask for their loyalty. She simply stood, steady and calm, allowing the cubs to speak for her. Finally, the eldest elder sighed, his voice low with something between frustration and respect. "You speak as though you know what loyalty means," he said. "Yet you are still young. You do not understand the weight of such choices." But the cubs did not waver. "We understand enough," one of them said. "Loyalty is not given to those who demand it. It is given to those who prove they deserve it. She proved it." The elders could not deny the truth in those words. They had seen loyalty bought with fear, with power, with strength. But never before had they seen cubs speak with such certainty about care and protection. Slowly, grudgingly, the murmurs among the people shifted. Some still distrusted, but others began to see the human in a different light, not as an outsider, but as someone who had touched the hearts of their young. As the meeting ended, the cubs remained by her side. They did not move when ordered to return to their kin. They did not step back when told their duty was finished. Instead, they looked up at the elders with steady eyes and declared that their duty had changed. They would not return as spies. They would remain as guardians. That night, as the firelight flickered across the settlement, the cubs sat around her, their bodies pressed close as though afraid she might vanish if they let go. The elders watched from afar, their expressions unreadable, but none dared to tear them away. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The cubs had made their choice, and in doing so, they had planted a seed of change in the hearts of their people. The woman did not celebrate or boast. She simply laid a hand on the nearest cub's head, her touch gentle and warm, her eyes soft with gratitude. She had not asked for their loyalty, but she accepted it with quiet respect. For the cubs, the choice was simple. She had stood for them, when the storm threatened to take their lives. Now they would stand for her no matter what storms might come next. The night after the storm and the cubs' return was heavy with silence. The elders sat around their great fire, their eyes fixed on the woman who now rested in their camp. No one spoke openly, but the tension was clear. She had not forced her way here, nor had she begged to stay. Yet she sat quietly while the cubs pressed close to her side, their loyalty written in every glance and movement. It was something no elder had prepared for. They had expected reports of human cunning, of hidden danger, of reasons to keep their borders guarded. Instead, they were faced with cubs who had declared her their protector, their alpha in all but name. The elders could not dismiss it easily. These were not just any young ones. They were the future of their people, raised to respect strength and truth. For them to stand beside her, against the weight of command, meant something powerful, had taken root. It was more than childish rebellion. It was conviction. Still, the elders argued among themselves late into the night. Some claimed she was a trickster who had bewitched the cubs. Others warned that to cast her out now, after she had saved their young, would create doubt among the people. Yet a few, quiet but firm, spoke of the lesson already laid bare before them. That true strength was not always shown by claws or dominance, but by bonds built across fear and mistrust. The next morning, the settlement awoke to whispers. Adults watched with curiosity, children with fascination as the woman walked through the camp with the cubs circling her like a shield. She did not carry herself with arrogance. She did not act as if she belonged. Every step was measured, humble, respectful of the space she was in. But the cubs' behavior made a louder statement than any words could. They did not let her walk alone. They nudged her forward, brushed against her legs, and stood between her and anyone whose gaze felt too sharp. The people had seen cubs loyal to leaders before, but never to an outsider. When she helped an elder woman lift a fallen bundle of wood, murmurs spread again. When she knelt to share food with children who had too little, those murmurs grew quieter. And when she sat by the fire in the evening, not at the center but just at the edge, speaking gently with whoever dared to approach, the people began to see her less as a stranger and more as a bridge they had not known they needed. The cubs themselves changed too. Where once they had been restless and eager only to prove their strength, now they carried a new patience in their movements. They watched her with attentive eyes, imitating her small habits, waiting before eating, sharing with one another, even laughing softly at small things. Their play no longer held only the rough edges of dominance. It carried the warmth of care. When one stumbled, the others helped it up. When one lagged, they slowed their steps. The elders could not ignore this. Something in the human's way had reshaped their own bloodline. One evening, the eldest of the council called a gathering. The fire burned high, casting long shadows across the circle of faces. The cubs sat in front, refusing to leave her side. The people gathered around, waiting for a decision. The eldest elder rose, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of change. He spoke of the storm, of the cubs' return, of the choice that had stunned them all. He admitted their suspicion, their fear, but he also acknowledged the truth they had witnessed. She has shown care where none was owed, he said. She has stood for those who were not her own. And our cubs, our future, have seen in her something worth following. Can we call her an enemy when they call her protector? A hush fell over the camp. The question lingered like smoke, drifting into every heart. Slowly, one by one, voices began to rise. Some remained doubtful, but others spoke of what they had seen with their own eyes. They could not deny the cub's loyalty. They could not deny the way she carried herself, not demanding respect, but quietly earning it. When it was her turn to speak, all eyes turned toward her. She rose slowly, her hands calm at her sides, her voice quiet but clear. She did not beg for acceptance, nor did she claim to deserve their trust. She simply told the truth, that she had not planned for this, that she had only done what she felt was right when the storm struck, that she could not stand by while lives were in danger, no matter what blood ran through their veins. Her words were simple, stripped of pride, but they carried weight because they were honest. The cubs pressed closer as she finished, their bodies forming a circle around her. Their silent stance said what no words could, that they would not leave her no matter what decision was made. That sight alone was enough to sway the hearts of many. In the end, the council did not declare her kin, but neither did they call her enemy. Instead, they gave her something greater, a place between. Not outside, not fully within, but as a bridge. From that day forward, her life changed. She was no longer watched as a threat, nor treated as a stranger. She began to walk freely in their lands, sharing her ways while learning theirs. The cubs never left her side, even as they grew. They trained with their people, but returned to her in the evenings, carrying stories, questions, laughter. The elders noticed the balance forming. The cubs were still strong, still fierce, but their strength was guided by a new sense of care and loyalty that made them wiser than their age. People too began to learn. They had long believed that strength was measured by dominance, by who could stand tallest, who could strike hardest, who could command the loudest. But as they watched her, they began to see that strength could also mean lifting another when they fell, standing in front of danger for someone else, choosing to protect rather than destroy. These were lessons they had not expected, but they could not deny their truth. Seasons passed. The cubs grew taller, their teeth sharper, their voices stronger. Yet they never forgot the storm or the warmth of the fire she had given them. They carried the memory in every choice they made, in every bond they built with their people. And though time often wears down memory, this one remained bright. For the elders, it was a lesson carved into history. For the cubs, it was a bond unbreakable. In the end, the human did not become their alpha in title. She did not sit on the council, nor command their warriors. But in a deeper way, she became something greater. She became the silent alpha of their hearts, the one they looked to for the kind of strength that could not be measured by dominance alone. She was the proof that bonds could rise above fear, above mistrust, above the lines that once divided them. And so the story of the cubs who were sent as spies but returned as guardians became more than just a tale of survival. It became the beginning of a new path, a bridge between two worlds that had once stood apart. Through her care, through their choice, both sides learned a truth they would carry forever. That the greatest power is not in conquering others, but in protecting them as your own.